Personal Finance on Lunchtime. Brought to you by the Irish Times. Now with dedicated daily business supplements.
It is that time of the week again here on News Talk Lunchtime, where we're joined in studio by the Money Doctor, John Lowe from moneydoctor.ie. John, you're very welcome
Great
to the
see you
studio.
in the flesh, Jonathan.
Absolutely, broadcasting here from Marconi House, both of us today. You can text us 53106 with all your personal finance queries. You can drop us an email at lunchtime@newstalk.ie. John, I want to start with the idea of personal debt, first of all, and the strain that personal debt puts on people, because in terms of mental health, we had a professor on last week, Professor Ian Webster. He was the chairman of the Australian Suicide Prevention Advisory Council. Now, they've had a very successful campaign over there, far more successful than we have had, and it has actually resulted in the number of suicides actually going down. We're going in the other direction here. Yeah. They had a lot of initiatives. Here's one that stuck out in my mind.
There's been training of financial counsellors during that recession period. They help people budget and sit down and engage in agricultural communities with farmers who are having trouble. And in fact, using the budget discussion or the financial discussion I've seen it working, where it's some of the best, in a sense, therapy or management of life that you could see happen with some of these people. Because you're saying to people, well, what are your priorities? What's important to you, and so on.
We have financial counsellors to a degree here. Yes. You know, there's the money and a budgetary advice service that's out there. I mean, people like you who do it as well. You must see tremendous strain on people when they come through the door.
It's unbelievable. I'd say 50% of my clients, for instance, are on the debt management side. And yes, it is affecting their mental health. It is affecting everything about them. And he is actually quite right, Professor Webster, in terms of the budgeting process, because that's something that you all have to go through. And the worst part about it is the people who are putting the head in the sand, you know, they don't look at the bills that come in through the letterbox. And that's exactly what you have to do when you actually wake up to the reality that you're not getting out of this debt unless you start doing a process. And that process, the first process, is the budgeting element of it.
And what people, when financial pressures get on top of them, they find themselves waking up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and the budget is running through their head. They can't see out, really, because all they can see is their bills.
That's, the reality is that there's always a solution. I mean, even no matter how bleak it is, Jonathan, there is always a solution, even if it means declaring bankruptcy. That's a solution. Even if it means that, there's no point, I keep saying it week after week, if you're using your savings, for instance, to supplement your debt repayments, your mortgage repayments, it's eventually going to run out. What happens then? It's the same aspect of those people who are paying interest only, for instance, and they're putting off the day when they're going to have to start making repayments, because that day is never going to arrive for some of those people. They will never be able to pay the capital back. They will never be able to continue this incessant interest only facility, because they'll run out of time as well.
And these financial counsellors, as we're talking about, there just isn't enough in this country, really, is there?
There isn't. My own sister, Joan Freeman, is chief executive of Pieta House, which is prevention
the suicide prevention group, yeah.
And I mean, there's an awful lot of I hate to say it, their business has grown, unfortunately. Unlike the Australian Suicide Prevention Advisory Council, which they seem to be going the other way, their figures. Our figures, unfortunately, going the other way. Maybe Australia wasn't as hit as badly, Jonathan, as Ireland has been. And there's an awful lot of depression, an awful lot of down people, in the country, and something has to be done.
The thing about it is the suicide figures that are the official suicide figures, it takes 2 or 3 years to compile all of them. We don't know officially how bad this will be until 2015, but the problem is one that's there now. John Teeling, he is the founder of the Cooley Distillery. We've had him on the programme before. He's been talking about this as well, due to make a speech today. He said you cannot continue to take money out of the economy and expect demand to grow. He goes on about the middle classes being destroyed, and this is the one for me. It's happening in front of our eyes. He said, take the middle class couple, they're in negative equity, the husband or wife goes out to work, then they come home poorer than they went out.
Absolutely.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And actually, this is the first time one of the major business leaders has come out and said, look, it's not about looking for a solution, it's a question of, you got to get rid of this debt. Let me give you an example of this. You have a 500,000 property, Jonathan. As I said before, the period between 2004, 2008, that was a critical period when people leveraged homes, leveraged their property, or else bought new. And so 500,000 is now worth 200,000. They borrowed 400,000. They can only afford the interest only. There's no way of repaying that capital. The extensions are made year after year on the interest-only facility. So effectively, as far as the lenders are concerned, these people are in arrears. For what? There's no sign of return to the values. And a lot of people out there don't realise, for the values to return, what actually has to happen? Inflation, number one, has to come back. With inflation comes higher interest rates. We are living in a very low interest rate environment. Once those interest rates start going up, you'll find that whereas the courts are already inundated, as was stated in the Independent this morning, they're inundated with all these personal insolvency bill cases. They'll even be more inundated with further cases. And I think that the vast majority, like Professor John Teeling said, going to work, working hard all day, knowing that they're worse off at the end of the day and something has to be done. And the choice is, you let them repossess or you write it off. They're the two choices.
Yeah, but the problem with this is where it sticks out in my mind. You talk about the situation whereby you're talking about interest only, or you're talking about people who can't even make those payments.
Yeah.
Everybody who took out a mortgage between 2005 and 2010 finds themselves in this boat, that even if they do manage to get more money, that money is gone, and they are quite literally going from day to day.
What needs to happen, Jonathan, is those properties, that element, if that was reduced, if that same proportion of the valuation from 500,000 is now worth 200,000, that's a 60% drop. You try putting the 60% drop to the mortgage that's on that property. Now you'd find a different kettle of fish.
All right. Well, let's get down to some of the questions that have come in. Lots of questions, as always, to 53106 for a cost of 30 cents. Carl has the first one. He says he bought his first house in 2004, and this is a prime example of this, actually. He said he bought his second home in 2010 as the family grew. He couldn't sell the first house because it was in negative equity. He rented that first house out and lost mortgage interest relief. So he wants to know, do I still qualify after recent changes? Rent doesn't cover the mortgage, so it would be of great help.
Yeah, well, I suppose first house, if you stayed in this house, the 30% relief on the mortgage interest would have been extended actually to 2017. Presumably you stopped that relief on the first house in 2010. Important to do so, as this could come back to you, by the way, because the relief, if you've let that house out, you will now have a tax liability. You also started making returns on the rent with relevant offsets. You will be entitled to 15% tax relief for a year on that second house. You should now not be claiming because you've run out of time. So sorry in Cole's case, but make sure you're claiming all the reliefs on the rented property.
Okay, the second question is from Steve. He says, I think I may have broken the first time buyer's rule for stamp duty exemption, as I needed to rent out the apartment. Will revenue now look for stamp duty based on what I bought the apartment for in 2007, or take into account the fact that the value is down 40%? I'm now earning only 20k a year, down from 65k. So any advice, please? Very stressful, Steve, is how he says.
This is where, we're talking about this kind of stress. Unfortunately, yes, Steve, that could be the case. If you bought before the 5th of December 2007, clawback was 5 years. But if you lived in the property for the first 2 years and only after this rented it out, then there's no stamp duty clawback. So if you only let it out in the last 2 years, you have no clawback. Stamp duty is based on what the rate would have been at the time of purchase, not what it is now, because it's only 1% up to €1 million. Anyway, that should help your stress, Steve. On another point, those who bought in the last 2 years exempt from stamp duty and now let it out are liable for that stamp duty clawback. And don't forget the tax relief at source. If you've bought a property and you've decided to let it out because you can no longer afford it, and you still claim the tax relief at source, you're in breach. You're in breach, unfortunately.
Look, who's going to help? I mean, look, this is a guy. He's on 65 grand when he went into the bank and got his mortgage. He's now on 20 grand.
Yeah,
he's probably one of the guys who's awake at 3:30 in the morning.
See, the problem is, the problem is that it will come back to haunt, because if the revenue then suddenly find out that all these people, they've been claiming tax relief at source, but they've let it out, it's in breach of the contract and it's breach of the rules. So, it's like the household charge. I agree, by the way, completely with what you said earlier, that it's law. Who we should have gone to are the TDs and the various lawmakers to try and stop them putting this through. But it's now through, so we've got to pay it.
I was so surprised over the weekend, speaking to a lot of different people who I met over the weekend, who are, like everyone else, perfectly law-abiding citizens. They pay their taxes. And they say categorically they're not going to pay this.
Well, you see, I agree with the concept of the idea that, you can't compare, for instance, a property in Westminster Road in Foxrock with that Cavan property that went for €7,500, and the same €100 is being levied on both. But that's not our problem. That's the lawmakers. They were the one who brought this in. So they're the ones who have to prove it and change it. So we just have to comply with the law. Complying with the law means you pay the €100. So I'm very surprised anybody who's not paying
poor old Steve, then there's another €100 he has to pay out as well for the property that he can't get proper income from. Question from Stephen, a different Stephen now. Got a tracker mortgage in 2008. Does it last for the length of the mortgage, he asks?
Yes, it does, Stephen. What the lender has agreed is to track your mortgage rate to the ECB rate. Currently, that ECB rate is 1%. And the margin then is the lender's profit. So it could have been as low as 0.5%. Those lucky people currently who might be listening to this who are on 0.5%, so it's 1.5% their total rate. The rate charges are brought in effect generally immediately, and the ECB rate is likely to remain, by the way, these low rates. And that's why I'd say it's such a false economy for the next 24 months. I presume Stephen is paying capital and interest payments. Sometimes, some of the lenders are using changes to as a kind of contract and a mechanism to take you off the tracker. So do not change the term, keep the conditions of the loan and maintain the payments. Then you'll be okay.
Someone else got in contact to say, can you please ask why AIB are using an internal rating system credit grade rather than the Irish Credit Bureau? This listener says they've never missed a payment on anything in their lives, but they're interest only. They can get nothing from AIB because their internal rating is poor or described as in arrears. Seems unfair when my payment record is perfect. But if you're interest only, is it perfect?
Yeah, that's it. That is the point here. And that's we're going back to the same conversation that even though they've maintained all these interest only payments, maybe that interest only payment, Jonathan, was there for maybe a term, maybe for the first 2 years, after which capital and interest were meant to be paid. And simply because maybe their job was down, or maybe one of them stopped working, or maybe they just simply can't afford it. They're technically in arrears. So that's why they're... And each bank...
So hang on now. Sorry, this is where I'm getting frustrated here. They've gone to the bank. They have negotiated with the bank. They've gone interest only. They're keeping their powder dry. The bank are getting interest off them.
Yeah, but they've gone against the contract. They've gone against the contract, which was say that they probably got an interest only facility for the first 2 years, maybe. And then after that, the capital is meant to kick in. Because they weren't able to kick in, they've agreed it. Okay, they have agreed and they got permission.
So now their name is mud in perpetuity because of AIB?
Internally. All the banks, all the current account banks, the Banks of Ireland, AIB, NIB, they have their own internal credit grade rating system. And so, if you're a grade 5, you can forget about, keep the doors locked. You can forget about getting credit again.
But does Bank of Ireland know that?
Oh, well, the Bank of Ireland will have put that rating on it. When you have said, but if it's by the way, my job has gone down and I can't afford the capital repayment, will you extend it? Yeah, no problem. We'll extend it and we'll just move you a grade down from 3 to 4.
But does Bank of Ireland know the internal grading of AIB?
They wouldn't. They wouldn't know. They have no. There's no collusion between the banks.
Okay.
No, not at all. But they would have their own. Except they would have collusion, Jonathan, in the ICB. Because your ICB is the Irish Credit Bureau, where you miss a payment.
Yeah, that's the way it should work, really, when you think about it. Luke in Cork has a question. How to get a student loan? He wants to study veterinary in Budapest, of all places. Obviously, the Budapest is the place to go if you want to be a vet these days. 55 grand it's going to cost. Parents have a lot of equity in a house, he says. Obviously, he wants some of it.
Well, first of all, 55,000 is a lot of money, Luke. And the only way you're going to obtain such a loan is to have security. Being a student, you obviously don't have that security. So he hasn't got a property. So the parents do, and in their home. So remember, all lending is based, and I keep saying this as well, is based on the ability to repay. No point in giving a loan if you can't pay it. So if you had a 100,000 property and you only wanted 10,000 loan, Jonathan, the 10,000, if you can't pay that 10,000 back, there's no point in taking the property because, they're going to repossess, have to sell it because you can't pay 10 grand. So the lender has to have the astuteness to know that the person who's been given the mortgage or the loan is going to be able to repay it. So therefore, your parents have to have income capacity. They also have to have the term. So they wouldn't want to be 70-year-olds looking for, say, a 5-year or 10-year term. Yeah. Not that they won't last 5 or 10 years, but it's too old to consider. And 65 is the maximum age that the loan should be finished at. So if he's 20, presumably the parents are maybe 45, 50, and therefore maybe 5-10-year loan might be okay. It'll be inside the 65
big ask, though, for
it's
any parents.
It's a big ask. And I know they love you to bits, but it's a lot of money.
All right, we'll leave it there. John Lowe from moneydoctor.ie, author of the best-selling Money Doctor Finance Annuals. You do face-to-face consultations as well, as you were telling about earlier on, or over the phone as well. Newstalk.ie is where you can get a podcast of John's column every week here on Newstalk Lunchtime. Lots still to come, in particular the anger that's out there, the levels of anger that are out there on the household charge. We'll touch on that.
Personal Finance on Lunchtime. Brought to you by the Irish Times. Now with dedicated daily business supplements.